A CEO's unseen world. Charles Benson stood in the middle of his sleek, modern office, overlooking the bustling skyline of Silicon Valley. At 45 years old, he had achieved more than he ever dreamed possible. He was the CEO of Nextech Innovations, a leading tech company that had become a household name in just under a decade. From humble beginnings in a small Georgia town, he had climbed the corporate ladder to unimaginable heights. His company was praised for its cutting-edge products and rapid growth. Yet, despite the accolades, something gnawed at him. As he glanced at his numerous awards and the framed articles praising his leadership, a sense of unease settled in his chest. To the outside world, Nextech was the epitome of success. But to Charles, it felt like something was missing. Employee satisfaction surveys showed glowing results, and productivity numbers were at an all-time high. But he couldn't shake the feeling that these reports didn't reflect the full picture. For weeks, Charles had mulled over rumors of workplace dissatisfaction and subtle whispers of mistreatment that had surfaced in anonymous employee feedback. Though small in number, these complaints pointed to issues of favoritism, toxic competitiveness, and burnout. They were in stark contrast to the image of a forward-thinking, employee-first culture that Charles believed his company had cultivated. He couldn't help but wonder, were these issues just the grumblings of a few, or were they the tip of a much larger iceberg? Determined to get to the root of the problem, Charles made a radical decision. He would go undercover as a janitor in his own company. It was the only way he could get an unfiltered look at how his employees truly felt. He needed to observe them up close, without the weight of his title or the influence of his authority. The idea came to him one late night after a conversation with his longtime mentor, an older CEO who had once shared that the best way to understand a company's culture was to see it through the eyes of those at the bottom of the hierarchy. It's one thing to lead from the top, but to truly know your company, you need to understand the experiences of those who work in the shadows, his mentor had said. Charles knew it would be a risk. Disguising himself as a janitor could backfire if anyone recognized him, but the potential benefits outweighed the risks. He craved the unvarnished truth, and this was the only way to get it. The following week, with the help of his most trusted confidant in human resources, Charles was outfitted with a blue janitorial uniform and given an alias, Charlie Benson, a new hire brought in through a temp agency. His HR partner ensured that no one would be aware of the undercover operation, not even the executive team. On his first night as Charlie, Charles walked through the back entrance of Nextech, avoiding the security desk where he was normally greeted with enthusiasm. This time, he was met with silence. His usual aura of authority disappeared, replaced by the anonymity of a blue uniform and a worn-out mop. As Charles made his way to the janitorial closet, he felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervousness. It had been decades since he'd worked any sort of manual labor job. Could he convincingly play the role of a janitor? He had no choice but to try. His first night passed uneventfully. He cleaned conference rooms, polished floors, and emptied trash bins, careful to keep to the background. Most employees worked late, heads buried in laptops, barely noticing the quiet man pushing a mop through the hallways. Still, Charles could hear snippets of conversations as he worked. There was talk of deadlines, frustration over impossible workloads, and occasional complaints about management. It was only his first day, but it was enough to stir his curiosity. The real Nextech, unmasking the culture. Charles Benson woke up earlier than usual on his second day disguised as a janitor. His mind buzzed with the events of the previous night, the endless whispers of overwork, the piles of coffee cups left behind without a second thought, and the look of exhaustion on the faces of the employees he had passed. The disconnect between the company he thought he ran and the one he was experiencing gnawed at him. He had always believed Nextech to be a progressive company that valued its employees. His board of directors constantly praised the corporate culture. But now, the shiny facade he had helped build seemed to be crumbling right before his eyes. The first week had been an introduction, a slow realization that something wasn't quite right. But today, he was determined to dive deeper. If he truly wanted to understand the heart of Nextech, he needed to look beyond just the engineers and support staff. He needed to interact more with the custodial team, the people who moved about unnoticed, the so-called invisible workforce that he was beginning to realize held the real keys to what was happening within his company. After slipping on his janitorial uniform, one that by now had started to feel strangely comfortable, Charles made his way into the heart of the building. Today, he would shadow Miguel, the senior janitor he had met briefly the night before. Miguel was a man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and calloused hands, who had worked at Nextech for nearly a decade. Charles could see that Miguel knew every inch of the building, from the slick marble lobbies to the dark, hidden corners where no one ever ventured. He was a silent presence, efficient and dependable. As Charles approached the janitorial closet to begin his shift, he saw Miguel packing up his supplies for the night. "Miguel, mind if I stick with you tonight? I'd like to learn the ropes from someone who knows the place inside and out," Charles said, his voice as casual as he could make it. Miguel eyed him for a second before giving a small nod. "Sure, Charlie. You can help me with the conference rooms today. The execs had a meeting earlier, and you know what that means, lots of coffee stains and garbage." Charles picked up his mop and followed Miguel through the maze of hallways that led to the executive suite. As they walked, Charles decided to gently prod for more information, to see if Miguel had any insights into the deeper workings of the company. "How long have you worked here, Miguel?" Charles asked, keeping his tone light. "Almost 10 years now," Miguel replied. "Long time. Seen a lot of people come and go. Some good, some not so good. And how's it been for you? Has the company changed much over the years?" Miguel paused for a moment before answering. "It's grown. A lot. But you know, the more it grows, the less it feels like a family. When I first started, the bosses would actually talk to us, ask about our families. Now, they don't even know our names. We're just here to clean up after them." Charles nodded, a knot forming in his stomach. He had never considered that his company's rapid growth could lead to such a disconnect between leadership and the employees on the ground. In the rush to become a tech giant, had they lost the very soul of what made Nextech special? Miguel continued, his voice soft but laced with disappointment. "I'm just a janitor, right? But sometimes I wonder if they even see me at all. It's like, we keep this place running, but nobody notices. They don't care about the little people anymore. And the pay, well, you know how it is. We're not exactly getting raises every year." Charles clenched his jaw. Here was a man who had given nearly a decade of his life to the company, and yet he felt unseen, undervalued. The more he listened, the more Charles realized that this wasn't just a Miguel problem. This was a Nextech problem. As they reached the executive conference room, the scene that awaited them was all too familiar. Half-empty coffee cups littered the table, along with crumpled papers and leftover food containers. The remnants of another high-level meeting. Without a word, Miguel grabbed a garbage bag and began cleaning up. Charles helped, working alongside Miguel in silence for a while before finally speaking up again. "You mentioned pay. Have you ever brought it up with anyone? I mean, after working here for so long, you'd think they'd want to make sure you're taken care of." Miguel chuckled dryly. "I did. Once, a few years back, I asked for a raise. Nothing big, just a little more to help with the bills. They told me they'd think about it. I'm still waiting." The casualness of Miguel's reply masked the deeper issue. Nextech had failed to invest in the people who made its daily operations possible. It was an oversight, one that Charles hadn't realized until now. To him, Nextech had always been about innovation and progress. But what was progress if it left people like Miguel behind? A different side of the company. Later that night, Charles sat alone in a corner of the break room, sipping a cup of water as his mind raced. He was beginning to see the company from a perspective he had never truly considered before. For so long, his focus had been on growth, expansion, and innovation. But what about the people who weren't directly involved in the product development or tech side? What about those who kept the company clean, functioning, and presentable? The unsung heroes who worked behind the scenes. He thought back to the company-wide surveys they sent out every quarter. He had always been proud of Nextech's high employee satisfaction ratings. But now, sitting in the break room as a janitor, he realized that those surveys didn't reach everyone. Did the janitors get a chance to share their thoughts? Did the part-time staff? The night shift workers? Or was the feedback loop only meant for the engineers, the designers, the marketing team, the employees of the core of Nextech's product? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Charles noticed a young woman walk into the break room, looking tired and frustrated. She was an IT support specialist, someone who was responsible for troubleshooting technical issues across the company. "Long night?" Charles asked, hoping to strike up a conversation. The woman glanced at him and sighed. "Yeah, you could say that. Our team's understaffed, and the system keeps crashing. I'm just trying to keep things together, but it feels like no one cares." "Why don't they hire more people?" Charles asked, genuinely curious. "They say they're looking into it, but it's been months. We're all stretched thin, and it's starting to show. I'm doing the work of 3 people, and I barely have time to breathe. Honestly, I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up." Charles felt a pang of guilt. Here was another part of his company, struggling under the weight of unrealistic expectations and insufficient resources. Nextech had always prided itself on being at the cutting edge of technology. But what good was that if the people behind the scenes were falling apart? He made a mental note to dig deeper into the IT department's staffing issues. This wasn't the first time he had heard complaints about understaffing, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But what struck him most was the young woman's resignation. She had given up on expecting things to change. "Have you talked to your manager about it?" Charles asked. She shook her head. "What's the point? They're too focused on meeting deadlines and rolling out new products. It's all about the bottom line." Charles's heart sank. He had always prided himself on being a CEO who listened, who cared about his employees. But somewhere along the way, that ethos had been lost. The company had grown too fast, and the human element had been pushed to the background. A growing divide. As the night wore on, Charles began to realize that the divide between Nextech's leadership and its workers was far wider than he had ever imagined. There were cracks in the foundation, cracks that had been papered over by high profits, glowing reviews, and rapid growth. But beneath the surface, the company was starting to show signs of wear. Charles spent the next few days continuing his work as a janitor, listening to the stories of those who felt unseen, unnoticed. From the engineers who were drowning in projects, to the administrative assistants who were treated as disposable, to the janitorial staff who felt invisible, it became clear that Nextech was not the company he had envisioned. It wasn't the company he thought he had built. And yet it was still his company. As he stood mopping the floors late one evening, Charles made a promise to himself. Things were going to change. He couldn't go back to the boardroom and pretend he hadn't seen what he had seen. The stories, the frustrations, the quiet despair of his employees, it all pointed to one undeniable truth: the culture at Nextech was broken, and it was up to him to fix it. But how? The hidden voices emerge. Charles Benson's undercover stint as a janitor had opened his eyes, but as he moved further into his second week, he began to realize just how deep the issues at Nextech ran. What he had first suspected to be isolated grievances were, in reality, systemic problems woven into the very fabric of the company. Yet, these issues weren't talked about openly, at least not where the leadership could hear. In his new role, Charles was discovering what many in leadership positions often miss. People talk when they believe no one is listening. And when Charles was in his janitor's uniform, he was invisible, just like the rest of the custodial team. This gave him a rare opportunity to hear the uncensored truth, the stories that never reached his desk as CEO. It was a few days later when the real breakthrough came. The overlooked team. Its silent struggles. That night, as Charles returned to the break room during his break, he noticed a small group huddled together near the vending machines. They were speaking in hushed tones, clearly venting about something. He recognized two of the employees, Madison from it and Jerome, a junior software engineer. Madison scoffed. "Talk to management. They're the ones driving this insane pace. The last time we brought up the need for more resources, they gave us a pep talk about working harder and smarter. It's like they don't even realize we're human beings." Charles felt the weight of her words. They don't even realize we're human beings. How had it come to this? Had he, in his drive to make NextEdge a powerhouse, turned his back on the very people who made that possible? Suddenly, Madison turned toward him, noticing the janitor she had never really paid attention to before. "Hey, you work nights, right? You ever see how crazy it gets here after hours? People leaving at midnight, coming back in by 7, and then the higher-ups wonder why we're all burnt out." Charles shrugged, keeping his head down. "Yeah, I've noticed. Seems like a lot of pressure around here." Madison nodded, clearly not thinking much of his comment. "Yeah, that's one way to put it." Charles continued cleaning, but his mind was racing. If Madison, a seasoned professional, felt this way, then how many others did too? And what was he going to do about it? The meeting behind closed doors. Later that week, Charles had the opportunity to witness something that shocked him to his core. It was late in the evening, and the executive boardroom was lit up for a high-level meeting. Charles, still playing the role of janitor, had been asked to clean the outer office while the meeting was in progress. He had no intention of eavesdropping, but as he swept the hallway leading to the boardroom, voices carried through the door, catching his attention. "We need to stop catering to the lower-level staff," one executive said in a tone dripping with frustration. "Every time we bend to their demands, we lose focus on the big picture. NextEdge is a tech leader. We need innovation, not complaints about work-life balance." Charles's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice of David Sterling, NextEdge's chief operations officer. Sterling had been with the company for almost as long as Charles had. He was a driving force behind much of their operational growth, but Charles had never suspected him of harboring such cold, dismissive views about the employees. Another voice chimed in, softer but equally unsettling. "Agreed. We've been giving too much attention to these complaints. We need to tighten up. Our focus should be on output and meeting deadlines. If people can't handle the pressure, they're in the wrong business." Charles's hands tightened around the broom handle. They were talking about his employees as though they were disposable, interchangeable cogs in the machine that was NextEdge. How had he missed this attitude? Was it always there, lurking beneath the surface, or had the company's success blinded him to the true cost of rapid growth? The conversation continued, but Charles had heard enough. He left the hallway quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. How could he, as CEO, allow this to go on any longer? Miguel's story. That night, Charles found himself working alongside Miguel again, as they tackled the lower-level offices. Miguel, always steady and quiet, seemed to sense that something was weighing on Charles's mind. "Charlie, you look like you've seen a ghost. You all right?" Miguel asked, his voice full of concern. Charles hesitated. He had been careful not to reveal too much about his thoughts during his undercover mission, but Miguel was someone he felt he could trust. "I heard something earlier, in one of the meetings. The execs, they don't seem to care about the people who actually work here. It's all about the numbers, the deadlines, the next big product. I don't know how we got here." Miguel stopped mopping and leaned against his broom, studying Charles with a knowing look. "That's how it is, Charlie. The higher-ups, they're up there in their offices, looking down at the rest of us like we're ants. They don't know what it's like down here, and they don't care. They just want to see those profits keep rising. Charles felt a pang of guilt. Was I like that too? Miguel sighed and went back to mopping. You know, I've been here long enough to see a lot of changes. When I first started, Nextech was smaller. We were a team. Everyone knew everyone. You could walk up to the CEO, have a chat. But now, it's like we're invisible. Just numbers on a spreadsheet. Charles swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had always prided himself on being an approachable leader, someone who valued every member of the company. But somewhere along the way, he had become disconnected. Miguel's words were like a mirror, reflecting back the harsh truth he had been avoiding. I've been thinking about leaving, Miguel added quietly. I love this place, but it's not the same anymore, and I'm not sure it ever will be. Charles's heart sank. Miguel, a loyal, hard-working employee who had dedicated nearly a decade of his life to Nextech, was ready to walk away. And it wasn't because of pay or benefits. It was because he no longer felt seen or valued. A new perspective. As Charles left work that night, he couldn't shake the conversations he had overheard, the frustrations he had witnessed, and the stark reality that Nextech was failing its people. The company's success had come at a cost that wasn't measured in dollars or product launches, but in the well-being of the very people who made Nextech what it was. Charles realized that fixing the problems at Nextech wasn't going to be easy. It would require a complete overhaul of the company's culture, starting with the leadership team. But more than that, it would require him to change. He couldn't go back to his office and pretend that this undercover experiment had never happened. He had seen too much. He had felt too much. The next step was clear. He needed to confront his executives, but not as CEO Charles Benson. He needed to approach them as the man who had just spent weeks cleaning their offices, listening to their employees, and learning what Nextech had become. As Charles lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he made a promise to himself. He would not let Nextech become another soulless corporate machine. He would fight to restore the company's heart and soul, even if it meant making some difficult decisions along the way. The time for change had come, confronting the heart of the problem. Charles Benson sat at his kitchen table the next morning, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He stared at the steam rising from it, though his mind was far from the present moment. The events of the past 2 weeks weighed heavily on him, especially the voices of employees like Madison, Jerome, and Miguel. It wasn't just their complaints that haunted him. It was the realization that he had been complicit in the culture that allowed such dissatisfaction to fester. The irony of it all didn't escape him. As a janitor, he had found more clarity about his company than he ever had as its CEO. Now he needed to decide what to do with this clarity. Changing the company's culture wasn't just a matter of issuing a few new policies or holding a couple of town hall meetings. The problem was bigger than that. It was systemic. And at the heart of that system were the leaders, himself included, who had either willfully ignored or simply failed to see the cracks forming beneath the company's polished surface. Charles knew what he had to do next, though it filled him with a sense of dread. He needed to confront the executive team, but not in his role as their CEO, barking orders from the top. This conversation required vulnerability, honesty, and accountability. It required the kind of leadership that didn't just react to problems but sought to understand and heal them at their core. The unexpected executive meeting. 2 days later, Charles arranged a meeting with his senior leadership team. The invitation had been uncharacteristically vague, simply stating that it was a critical discussion about the company's future. His assistant, Sarah, had raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. After all, Charles had earned a reputation for being an innovative and sometimes unconventional leader. The executive boardroom was bathed in natural light that morning, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. The room itself was a symbol of Nextech's success, sleek, modern, and imposing, with a long glass table that seemed to stretch on forever. One by one, the key players in the company filed in. David Sterling, The COO, whose dismissive attitude toward employee welfare had infuriated Charles during that overheard meeting, sat confidently at the head of the table. Next to him was Lindsay, the head of HR, a woman who had always prided herself on maintaining company morale, but now seemed increasingly disconnected from the reality of the employees' lives. James, the CFO, who was always more concerned with spreadsheets than people, settled into his chair, already tapping away on his tablet. Once the entire team was seated, Charles entered the room, not with his usual brisk walk, but with a slow, deliberate pace. He took his seat at the head of the table but didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence linger, forcing everyone in the room to feel the weight of his presence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Charles spoke. "I've spent the last few weeks doing something none of you know about," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I've been working undercover as a janitor." The room went still. David Sterling's fingers froze over his tablet. Lindsay looked up from her notes, eyes wide with confusion. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if unsure if this was some kind of joke. "I've been listening," Charles continued, "watching, talking to our employees, and I've discovered things that I never would have learned sitting in this office." There was a pause, and then Sterling chuckled, a low, disbelieving sound. "You're joking, right? I mean, come on, Charles, this is—" "I'm not joking," Charles interrupted, his voice sharp. "And what I've learned in these weeks has left me speechless. This company, the one we've built together, has a problem. A deep, systemic problem." He stood up from his chair, walking slowly around the table as he spoke, making eye contact with each executive as he passed them. "We're failing our people. And not just a little. We're failing them miserably." James frowned, setting his tablet aside. "What do you mean?" "We've had some of the best financial quarters in the company's history. Productivity is at an all-time high." "Productivity," Charles repeated, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "Yes, our employees are productive. But at what cost? We have teams who are overworked, underappreciated, and burning out at alarming rates. We've become so focused on output and deadlines that we've lost sight of the human beings behind those numbers." Sterling leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Charles, this is a business. Of course, there's pressure. Everyone feels it. But people need to toughen up. If they can't handle the demands of a tech company, maybe they're not cut out for this industry." Charles stopped, standing directly across from Sterling now, his eyes locked onto him. "That's the exact attitude that's killing this company from the inside out, David. And it's wrong." Sterling opened his mouth to respond, but Charles held up his hand to stop him. "I've spoken with people like Madison and it, who have been shouting into the void about systemic issues that are being ignored because we're too focused on the next product launch. I've heard from employees like Jerome, who are being pushed to the breaking point with unrealistic deadlines and no support. And I've spent time with our custodial staff, like Miguel, who feels completely invisible despite the years he's dedicated to this company." The room fell silent again, the weight of Charles's words sinking in. "What you're all failing to see is that Nextech's success isn't sustainable if it's built on the backs of employees who feel undervalued and overworked," Charles said, his voice rising with passion. "If we don't change, if we don't start treating our people like the valuable assets they are, we're going to lose them. And when we lose our people, we lose everything." Lindsay, the head of HR, cleared her throat, her face pale. "Charles, I hear what you're saying. But we've done employee surveys. We've held focus groups. We've tried to address concerns. Surveys and focus groups won't fix this, Lindsay," Charles replied, his tone softer now, but no less firm. "What we need is a fundamental shift in how we lead this company. It starts with us. We can't keep sitting in these high-rise offices, detached from the people who are making Nextech run. We need to be present. We need to listen. And we need to act." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "So, here's what's going to happen. Starting today, we're implementing some major changes. First, we're going to reduce the workload for every department. We're going to hire more staff to support the teams that are stretched too thin. Second, we're going to create an open-door policy, a real one, where any employee, at any level, can come to leadership with their concerns without fear of retaliation. David Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly not liking where this was headed. And finally, Charles continued, his gaze now fixed on Sterling. We're going to make sure that every single leader in this company, including the ones in this room, spends time in the trenches with our employees. I want each of you to experience what it's like to work here from the ground up. Only then will you truly understand what's at stake. James, the CFO, looked skeptical. Charles, this all sounds good in theory, but won't it hurt our bottom line? I mean, hiring more staff, slowing down production. How are we supposed to stay competitive? Charles took a deep breath, knowing this was coming. Yes, there will be short-term costs. But if we don't invest in our people now, the long-term damage will be far worse. We'll lose talent, we'll lose innovation, and we'll lose the very thing that made Nextech great in the first place, our ability to be a company that cares as much about its people as it does its profits. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't the stunned disbelief from earlier. It was the quiet contemplation of people who were beginning to realize that things needed to change. I'm not asking, Charles said, his voice steady. These changes are happening, and I expect each of you to support them. A culture shift in motion. Charles Benson left the executive meeting with a sense of accomplishment, but also uncertainty. He had made his stance clear, but now came the real test: execution. Changing the culture of a company as large and complex as Nextech wasn't going to happen overnight, and it wasn't going to be easy. The coming weeks would be critical in determining whether his bold new direction would be embraced or quietly resisted by those who stood to lose their comfortable positions of power. The executive team, though reluctantly supportive, still had their doubts. David Sterling, the COO, and others had spent years fostering an environment of efficiency and performance, with little regard for the human cost. Charles knew that despite their agreement in the boardroom, some of them would be looking for ways to undermine the changes, especially if they affected short-term profits. But Charles was prepared for this. He had a vision, and he wasn't about to let resistance from within derail it. Over the next few days, he began to roll out his plan, starting with the most important step: reconnecting with his people. Taking action, walking the floors again. Charles decided to return to the factory floor, not as a janitor, but as himself, the CEO. This time, however, his goal was different. He wasn't undercover anymore, but he wanted to be present in a way that he had never been before. He would walk the floors, speak to employees, and listen. Really listen to what they had to say. On a bright Monday morning, Charles donned a simple shirt and jeans and made his way to the manufacturing wing of Nextech's headquarters. As he walked through the wide, brightly lit hallways, he was greeted by surprised faces. People weren't used to seeing the CEO on the floor, especially not without an entourage of executives or consultants. He stopped by the assembly line, where employees were hard at work assembling the latest tech gadgets that would soon hit the market. He approached a small group of workers who were clearly taken aback by his presence. "Good morning," Charles said with a warm smile. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them, a woman named Keisha, spoke up. "Of course, Mr. Benson." "Ah, what brings you down here?" "I'm here to learn," Charles said simply. "I want to understand what it's really like to work on the ground level of Nextech. I've been up in my office for too long, and I realized I've lost touch with what really matters: the people who make this company run." Keisha smiled nervously, but seemed to appreciate his honesty. "Well, I guess you've come to the right place. It's not always easy down here." Charles nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here. Tell me, what's the hardest part of your job?" Keisha hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should be completely honest with the CEO. But something about Charles' presence made her feel comfortable. "It's the pressure, Mr. Benson. We're always being told to speed up production, to meet tighter deadlines. It feels like we're just machines, sometimes, not people. And when things go wrong, it's usually because we're being pushed too hard." Charles listened intently, his expression serious. "I've heard similar things from others," he said. "It's clear that we've been putting too much emphasis on speed and not enough on quality of life for our employees. That's going to change." Keisha looked surprised. "Really? I mean, I've been here for 5 years, and things have always been like this. You think it can really change?" Charles met her gaze. "It has to change. I can't promise it'll happen overnight, but we're starting a process now. And I want you and everyone else to hold us accountable. If you see something that isn't working or something that's making your job harder, I want to know about it. We're in this together." Keisha smiled, a genuine smile this time. "Thank you, Mr. Benson. That means a lot." Charles spent the rest of the day moving through different departments, talking to as many employees as he could. He met people in customer service, in logistics, and in the research and development wing. Each conversation provided him with more insight into the challenges his employees were facing, and more importantly, it gave him ideas about how to address those challenges. Implementing structural changes. After his time on the floor, Charles returned to his office, energized and determined. He knew that changing the culture meant changing the structure that supported it. It was time to implement the first phase of his plan: staffing changes. There was a long pause before David Sterling finally spoke, his voice begrudging but resigned. "All right, Charles. If this is the direction you want to take the company, I'll back you. But we're going to need to see results." "We will," Charles replied. "But first, we're going to rebuild the foundation. Because without a strong foundation, everything else will eventually crumble." The turning point. As the meeting adjourned and the executives filed out, Charles stayed behind in the boardroom, staring out at the city skyline once again. This time, though, his gaze wasn't filled with the satisfaction of past achievements. It was filled with determination for the future. Nextech was about to undergo a transformation, and it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, pushback, and difficult decisions ahead. But Charles knew that it was the right thing to do, not just for the company's future, but for its soul. He had spent too long in his high-rise office, disconnected from the very people who made his company great. That was over now. Charles Benson was no longer just a CEO. He was a leader, a real one. And he was ready to fight for the heart of his company, no matter the cost. A culture shift in motion. Charles Benson left the executive meeting with a sense of accomplishment, but also uncertainty. He had made his stance clear, but now came the real test: execution. Changing the culture of a company as large and complex as Nextech wasn't going to happen overnight, and it wasn't going to be easy. The coming weeks would be critical in determining whether his bold new direction would be embraced or quietly resisted by those who stood to lose their comfortable positions of power. The executive team, though reluctantly supportive, still had their doubts. David Sterling, the COO, and others had spent years fostering an environment of efficiency and performance, with little regard for the human cost. Charles knew that despite their agreement in the boardroom, some of them would be looking for ways to undermine the changes, especially if they affected short-term profits. But Charles was prepared for this. He had a vision, and he wasn't about to let resistance from within derail it. Over the next few days, he began to roll out his plan, starting with the most important step: reconnecting with his people. Taking action, walking the floors again. Charles decided to return to the factory floor, not as a janitor, but as himself, the CEO. This time, however, his goal was different. He wasn't undercover anymore, but he wanted to be present in a way that he had never been before. He would walk the floors, speak to employees, and listen, really listen, to what they had to say. On a bright Monday morning, Charles donned a simple shirt and jeans and made his way to the manufacturing wing of Nextech's headquarters. As he walked through the wide, brightly lit hallways, he was greeted by surprised faces. People weren't used to seeing the CEO on the floor, especially not without an entourage of executives or consultants. He stopped by the assembly line, where employees were hard at work assembling the latest tech gadgets that would soon hit the market. He approached a small group of workers who were clearly taken aback by his presence. "Good morning," Charles said with a warm smile. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" The workers exchanged nervous glances before one of them, a woman named Keisha, spoke up. "Of course, Mr. Benson. What brings you down here?" "I'm here to learn," Charles said simply. "I want to understand what it's really like to work on the ground level of Nextech. I've been up in my office for too long, and I realized I've lost touch with what really matters, the people who make this company run." Keisha smiled nervously, but seemed to appreciate his honesty. "Well, I guess you've come to the right place. It's not always easy down here." Charles nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here. Tell me, what's the hardest part of your job?" Keisha hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should be completely honest with the CEO. But something about Charles' presence made her feel comfortable. "It's the pressure, Mr. Benson. We're always being told to speed up production, to meet tighter deadlines. It feels like we're just machines sometimes, not people. And when things go wrong, it's usually because we're being pushed too hard." Charles listened intently, his expression serious. "I've heard similar things from others," he said. "It's clear that we've been putting too much emphasis on speed and not enough on quality of life for our employees. That's going to change." Keisha looked surprised. "Really? I mean, I've been here for 5 years, and things have always been like this. You think it can really change?" Charles met her gaze. "It has to change. I can't promise it'll happen overnight, but we're starting the process now. And I want you and everyone else to hold us accountable. If you see something that isn't working or something that's making your job harder, I want to know about it. We're in this together." Keisha smiled, a genuine smile this time. "Thank you, Mr. Benson. That means a lot." Charles spent the rest of the day moving through different departments, talking to as many employees as he could. He met people in customer service, in logistics, and in the research and development wing. Each conversation provided him with more insight into the challenges his employees were facing, and more importantly, it gave him ideas about how to address those challenges. Implementing structural changes. After his time on the floor, Charles returned to his office, energized and determined. He knew that changing the culture meant changing the structure that supported it. It was time to implement the first phase of his plan: staffing changes. The company had been operating on a skeleton crew in many departments, which explained why employees like Jerome were feeling overwhelmed and burnt out. Charles worked with HR to immediately begin the process of hiring additional staff. His plan wasn't just to add more hands to the assembly line, but to focus on creating well-rounded teams that could support each other and reduce the burden on individual employees. "We're not going to rush this," Charles told Lindsay, the head of HR, during one of their meetings. "I want to make sure that we're hiring the right people for the right positions, and I want to ensure that every new hire understands the culture shift we're trying to create. It's not just about filling positions. It's about building a team that values each other." Lindsay, who had initially been skeptical of Charles' new direction, was starting to come around. "I have to admit," she said, "it's refreshing to hear this approach. I think the employees will appreciate the effort you're putting in." Charles nodded. "They deserve it. They're the ones who make Nextech what it is." Facing the resistance. Not everyone was as receptive to the changes, however. As expected, Charles faced resistance from parts of the executive team, particularly from David Sterling. In private meetings, Sterling continued to express his concerns about the impact the changes would have on the company's productivity and profitability. "This is going to slow us down, Charles," Sterling argued during one heated discussion. "We've built our reputation on being fast, efficient, and innovative. If we start pulling back now, we risk falling behind the competition." Charles had anticipated this pushback. I hear you, David, but we've been moving so fast that we've lost sight of what really matters, our people. If we don't take care of them, we're going to lose the very thing that makes us competitive. Innovation doesn't come from exhausted employees. It comes from people who feel valued and supported. Sterling shook his head. It's a nice sentiment, but I just don't see how we can afford to make these changes. Charles leaned forward, his tone firm but calm. We can't afford not to. Look, David, I get it. You've been with this company as long as I have, and you've always been focused on growth. But growth at the expense of our employees isn't sustainable. We need to evolve, or we'll collapse under our own weight. Sterling didn't respond right away, but Charles could tell that his words were starting to sink in. The COO wasn't an unreasonable man, just a man who had been conditioned to prioritize numbers over people. It would take time, but Charles was confident that even someone like David could eventually come around. Creating spaces for employee voices. One of the most important initiatives Charles implemented was the creation of employee-led committees. These committees were designed to give workers a direct voice in how the company operated. Each department would elect representatives who would meet with leadership on a regular basis to discuss concerns, suggest improvements, and help shape company policy. This was a radical shift from Nextech, which had always operated in a top-down manner. But Charles believed that empowering employees to take ownership of their work environment would not only improve morale, but also lead to better results. We need to stop pretending that leadership has all the answers, Charles said during one of the first committee meetings. The people who do the work every day, the ones on the front lines, often have the best ideas about how to make things better. We're going to listen to those ideas from now on. The committees quickly became a hit among employees. People like Jerome, who had felt invisible and unheard for so long, finally had a platform to express their frustrations and propose solutions. And to their surprise, leadership was actually listening. The early results. It didn't take long for the early results of Charles' changes to become apparent. Within weeks, employees reported feeling less stressed and more supported. Productivity, while initially slowing down due to the adjustments, began to pick up again. But this time, it was sustainable. The new hires eased the burden on overworked teams, and the open communication channels allowed for faster problem-solving and more creative collaboration. Even David Sterling, who had been the most vocal critic of the changes, began to acknowledge their positive impact. In a private meeting with Charles, he admitted, "I still have my reservations, but I can't deny that the atmosphere around here is different. People seem happier, more engaged." Charles smiled. "That's the goal, David. Happy employees create great work. It's a win-win." A new kind of leadership. As the months passed, Charles continued to lead by example. He didn't retreat back into his corner office, content with the changes he had initiated. Instead, he remained a constant presence on the floors, checking in with employees, attending committee meetings, and making sure that the culture shift stayed on track. The journey was far from over, but Charles knew that Nextech was on the right path. The company was becoming the kind of place he had always envisioned, a place where innovation thrived alongside empathy, where success wasn't measured solely by profit margins, but by the well-being of the people who made that success possible. For Charles Benson, this wasn't just about saving the company. It was about creating a legacy that would endure, one built on respect, integrity, and the unwavering belief that a business could be both profitable and humane. And as he looked out over the factory floor one day, watching his employees work together with newfound purpose and pride, he knew he had made the right choice. The path forward, a new era at Nextech. As the months rolled on, Nextech transformed from a company on the brink of collapse into a thriving enterprise defined by its people-centered culture. Charles Benson stood at the helm of this change, aware that while they had achieved significant milestones, the real test of their newfound values would be their ability to sustain momentum in the face of adversity. The new leadership team. Charles recognized that fostering a positive culture required not just changes in policies, but also a reshaping of leadership. He had spent the previous months actively working with department heads and middle management to instill a sense of shared responsibility and accountability. To that end, he initiated a leadership retreat, an immersive experience designed to unify the leadership team and instill a deeper understanding of the company's new mission. The retreat was set in the serene mountains of Northern California, away from the bustle of Silicon Valley. The goal was to create an environment that encouraged open communication, creativity, and collaboration. On the first day, the team participated in a series of activities aimed at breaking down barriers. They engaged in trust-building exercises, shared personal stories about their journeys, and discussed the lessons learned from their own experiences. As the sun set behind the mountains, Charles encouraged everyone to reflect on what they had heard. "What I want to see," he said, "is a leadership team that embodies the values we're promoting at Nextech. We can't expect the culture to change if we don't model it ourselves. Let's make a commitment today to lead with empathy, to listen actively, and to prioritize our people's well-being." The leaders nodded, some visibly moved. The walls that had once separated them began to crumble as they connected on a deeper level. The feedback loop. With a unified leadership team, Charles understood the importance of establishing a continuous feedback loop with employees. To ensure everyone's voice was heard, he launched an initiative called Voice of the Employee. This program encouraged employees at all levels to share their thoughts, suggestions, and concerns anonymously. The feedback collected would be discussed during regular town hall meetings, where Charles and the leadership team would address employees' questions directly. In the first session, as Charles reviewed the feedback, he was struck by the insights offered. Employees expressed appreciation for the cultural shift, but also pointed out areas needing improvement, particularly regarding workload distribution and the need for more cross-department collaboration. Charles addressed the crowd with a sense of humility. "Your feedback matters. It's not just a checkbox for us. It's a way to guide our journey. We're all in this together, and I promise we will address your concerns." Over time, the feedback loop became a cornerstone of Nextech's culture, fostering a sense of ownership among employees. They felt empowered to influence their work environment, and the company began to flourish under this new spirit of collaboration. The first annual Nextech Culture Summit. As the year progressed, Charles decided to take their commitment to culture even further by organizing the first annual Nextech Culture Summit. This event aimed to celebrate the company's achievements while reinforcing its values. The summit featured guest speakers from various industries who shared their insights on leadership, inclusivity, and innovation. Charles was excited to see how far they had come and wanted to share that journey with the world. The day of the summit arrived, and the auditorium was filled with employees, local community leaders, and even some skeptical investors. The energy was electric as Charles took the stage, beaming with pride. "Today, we're not just celebrating our successes, we're affirming our commitment to a better future, for ourselves, for each other, and for the communities we serve," he began, his voice resonating with passion. He highlighted the transformation Nextech had undergone, sharing stories of employees who had thrived in the new culture. One particularly moving story was that of Anna, a young engineer who had started as an intern. She had faced numerous challenges early in her career, but thanks to the mentorship and support she received at Nextech, she had quickly moved up the ranks. Anna exemplifies what we are trying to achieve at Nextech, a culture where everyone can flourish, regardless of their background. Let's continue to lift each other up and create an environment where innovation can thrive. Charles concluded, his words met with thunderous applause. Facing new challenges. As the glow of the summit faded into the backdrop of daily operations, Charles knew that while Nextech had made significant progress, the journey was far from over. Challenges were inevitable, especially as the tech industry continued to evolve at a rapid pace. The company faced increasing competition from emerging startups that often had fewer resources but were nimble and innovative. Investors were becoming restless, eager for more immediate financial returns, and some questioned the sustainability of their people-first approach. During a tense board meeting, David Sterling once again raised concerns about the financial implications of their new policies. While I appreciate the focus on culture, we need to ensure that we're also meeting our growth targets. Our competitors aren't slowing down, and neither should we. Charles understood David's perspective, but felt a deep sense of responsibility to uphold the values they had established. I hear you, David, but if we sacrifice our culture for short-term gains, we risk everything we've built. A sustainable future comes from a thriving workforce. Let's remember that. The board discussion intensified, but Charles remained steadfast in his beliefs. He proposed a strategy that combined a focus on culture with a renewed emphasis on innovation. Let's create innovation task forces within each department, he suggested. These teams can explore new ideas and projects, and we can support their efforts while still keeping our core values intact. The proposal was met with mixed reactions, but it ultimately passed, marking a compromise that Charles hoped would lead to both cultural and financial success. A focus on innovation. With the task forces established, employees were encouraged to pitch new ideas and collaborate across departments. The atmosphere became charged with excitement as teams worked together, experimenting with fresh concepts and solutions. Charles made it a point to visit each task force regularly, providing support and encouragement. He listened to their ideas, shared feedback, and celebrated their successes, big or small. The innovative spirit was palpable, and it wasn't long before some remarkable ideas began to emerge. One standout project was spearheaded by Anna, the young engineer who had once struggled to find her footing. She and her team proposed a groundbreaking new product, a smart home device that used AI to enhance energy efficiency. This idea not only had the potential to generate significant revenue, but also aligned perfectly with Nextech's commitment to sustainability. When Anna presented her concept at a company-wide meeting, the room buzzed with enthusiasm. This product isn't just about tech. It's about making a difference in people's lives while protecting our planet, she emphasized. As Charles watched her passion radiate, he felt a renewed sense of hope for the future of Nextech. Bridging the gap with the community. Recognizing that corporate success was not isolated from the community, Charles also sought ways to strengthen Nextech's ties to the local area. He initiated a series of community outreach programs aimed at fostering relationships and giving back. Nextech employees began volunteering their time in local schools, mentoring students interested in STEM careers. They hosted workshops to teach coding and computer skills, inspiring the next generation of innovators. At a local high school, Charles attended an event where Nextech employees introduced students to robotics and programming. Watching the excitement in the students' eyes reminded him of his own journey. I believe every child deserves the opportunity to pursue their dreams, he told the crowd. It's our responsibility to help pave the way. An unexpected crisis. Just as things began to flourish, Nextech faced an unexpected crisis. A significant data breach occurred, exposing sensitive customer information and putting the company's reputation on the line. Charles immediately convened the leadership team to address the situation. Tensions ran high as they discussed their strategy for handling the fallout. David expressed his concern about how this incident would impact investor confidence. We need to be transparent and act quickly, Charles stated firmly. Our culture is built on trust, and we can't lose that. Let's communicate openly with our customers and the public about what happened and how we're addressing it. The team sprang into action, developing a comprehensive response plan. They communicated with affected customers, provided free credit monitoring, and offered public reassurances that they were enhancing their security measures. In the days that followed, Charles made a public statement, expressing regret for the breach and reaffirming the company's commitment to protecting its customers. He emphasized that they would learn from this incident and strengthen their systems to prevent future occurrences. The response garnered a mix of support and criticism, but Charles believed they had done the right thing by being transparent. He knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but he was determined to do whatever it took to protect the values they had established. The road ahead. As the dust settled from the crisis, Charles reflected on the lessons learned. He understood that challenges were an inherent part of any organization's journey, especially in the fast-paced tech industry. However, it was how they responded to these challenges that would ultimately define their legacy. Encouraged by their resilience, he called for a meeting with the leadership team to brainstorm ways to prevent future incidents. "We need to be proactive, not reactive," he asserted. "Let's create a culture of continuous improvement, where we're always looking for ways to enhance our processes, not just in security but across the board." With renewed determination, the team dove into the task, driven by a shared commitment to ensuring Nextech remained a leader not just in technology, but in ethical practices as well. A legacy of change. Months passed, and as Nextech continued to grow, Charles became a sought-after speaker at industry conferences. His insights on leadership, empathy, and culture began to inspire others within and outside the tech community. He was often approached by leaders from other companies seeking advice on their own cultural transformations. Charles embraced these opportunities, eager to share what he had learned on his journey. During one such conference, a young woman approached him after his speech. "Your story about Nextech inspired me to rethink my approach to leadership," she said. "I want to create a culture of inclusion in my company, just like you did." Her words resonated with Charles, and he felt a sense of pride in the ripple effect their work was creating. It wasn't just about Nextech anymore. It was about a movement toward a better way of leading and working. As he walked through the venue, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. From a CEO facing criticism to a leader who had embraced the power of empathy and collaboration. Charles was determined to continue pushing boundaries and challenging norms, knowing that the journey ahead would be filled with both triumphs and trials. In a world driven by innovation, Charles Benson had found his calling, not just as a leader of a successful tech company, but as a catalyst for positive change, showing that true leadership begins with understanding, compassion, and a genuine desire to uplift others. And so, as Nextech moved forward, it did so with the confidence that it was not merely building technology, it was building a legacy, one rooted in humanity, trust, and the unwavering belief that the best path forward is one paved with purpose.